Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books, and we are continuing reading Who Ate the First Oyster by Cody Cassidy. This is Who Drank the First Beer. In the time of our species on Earth, if it were a day, this happened at 10:48 at night. On a September morning in 1795, mutiny broke out aboard the Royal Navy's HMS Defiance. The 74-gun ship of the line had recently returned from a long and chilly voyage through the Baltic Sea. But despite making port near the Scottish city of Edinburgh, Captain Sir George Home continued to serve his men a watery grog that was, quote, as thin as muslin and quite unfit to keep the cold, end quote, according to one disgruntled sailor's report. After months of drinking the unsatisfying brew, the crew revolted and stormed the captain's quarters. The insurrection took 2 days and the assistance of another ship to finally be put down. 5 sailors were eventually hanged. The mutiny over the thin grog was far from the first time alcohol drove hominins to make an irrational decision. According to geneticists, our dogged pursuit of alcohol began long, long ago. Studies suggest the enzymes in the hominin gut enabling our ancestors to break down ethanol dramatically improved when approximately 10 million years ago, presumably when the common ancestor of gorillas, chimps, and humans began spending more time on the ground eating fallen fermented fruit. Geneticists believe natural selection not only favored those apes able to digest the ethanol in these boozy but otherwise nutritious fruits, but also favored those who sought out its distinctive smell and taste. These were not drunken apes, however. The alcohol content in fermented fruit is low compared to its volume, so this was a food, not a drug. The intoxicating effects came much later, when hominins learned to concentrate the juice of fermented fruit to make wine and add water to honey to make mead. The formula for both wine and mead is so simple they may well have been made before Homo sapiens evolved. Yet, neither wine nor mead had the dramatic effect on society that beer did. Beer is made from cereals, which means that it can be stored, predictably located, and harvested in mass quantities. With the discovery of beer, alcohol, for the first time, became available on demand. Given what we know about alcohol's motivating effect, it should be no surprise this discovery represented a pivotal moment in human history. Yet, the discovery of beer takes on even more import because cereals are not only a source of alcohol, they're also a food. Today, they provide nearly half of the world's calories, and their intensive cultivation sparked the agricultural revolution, the first transition from hunting and gathering to farming and herding, which to this day remains the most consequential shift in human history. Because the first farmers worked harder and lived shorter, unhealthier lives than hunter-gatherers, many scholars have long believed that no one chose to farm. Instead, they believe hunter-gatherers living in Mesopotamia were lured into it, like a lobster entering a trap. The bait, however, may not have been the pursuit of bread, as many have long believed. Instead, a growing body of evidence suggests it was beer, which would make the first brewer one of the most important people in human history. Who was it? I'll call her Osiris, and to her I'll propose because she brewed her beer from seeds of either wheat, barley, or rye, all of which would have been more likely gathered by a woman in the hunter-gatherer community. Osiris was born nearly 15,000 years ago in a small village in the Middle East, likely in a site like the one archaeologists called Shubaika in northeast Jordan, where in 2018 a team of archaeologists discovered the oldest baked cereals ever found. Osiris was an early member of a group archaeologists called the Natufians, who were among the first people to live in the same place throughout the year. Yet she was not a farmer. Until the 1970s, most archaeologists believed farmers were the first to settle into year-round residences. But discoveries of multiple sites in and around the Euphrates Valley have proven the opposite. Hunter-gatherers like Osiris lived in one place for thousands of years before they began to farm. As a Natufian, Osiris likely stood roughly 5 feet tall and was darker skinned with brown eyes and black hair, according to geneticists' estimates. She made her home in a circular, semi-underground stone building with a stone foundation and wood walls in a village with a small handful of similar buildings. The entire population of Sibaika was less than 200, yet because it was occupied year-round, it was one of the largest cities in the world. She would have decorated herself with small stone, shell, and bone ornaments. She used ostrich shells as containers, fashioned fish hooks and harpoons out of bone, and made animal and human figurines out of limestone, and took part in feasts to honor her dead. Archaeologists have discovered the grave of one Natufian woman, thought to have been a kind of shaman, buried with 86 tortoise shells. Osiris lived in a time and place of bounty. Her home was far less arid than it is today, and yearly runoff from the nearby Druze Mountains turned the plains into a semi-permanent wetland. Herds of auroch and gazelle gathered nearby to drink from the water, while the fertile highlands supported legumes, almonds, and pistachios. Anthropologists still debate why the Natufians settled into permanent villages, but the simplest explanation is that they lived in an area of year-round plenty. One inevitable consequence of their sedentary life was their gradual accumulation of heavy items that would have been impractical when life was spent on the move. These heavy tools included harvesting equipment and kitchen appliances like stone grinders, sickles, and 40-gallon limestone cauldrons. They opened up new possibilities and new food sources, principally the gathering and grinding of seeds, and eventually the brewing of beer. Osiris spent her days gathering the plentiful fruits, nuts, and tubers near her village. Occasionally she would have harvested the wild ancestor of wheat, but it probably wasn't a staple, because ripened wild wheat bursts its seeds onto the ground, forcing her to stoop for each one. Eventually, as humans repeatedly selected for the tough Rockies gene in wheat plants that kept ripened seeds within their shell, we changed the nature of the plant. But in the time of Osiris, that development had yet to occur. As a result, the caloric returns for gathering wild wheat would have been, in the words of paleobotanist Jonathan Sauer, pitifully small. Before the discovery of beer, hunter-gatherers rarely bothered with it. When Osiris gathered her wheat seeds, she was probably looking for something else, and happened to stumble upon a wheat plant with the rare Tufraki's mutation. Without having to gather the ripened seeds off the ground, she could have threshed a bushel directly from the plant, as is done modernly. Using the seeds, Osiris would have made herself the Natufians' version of gruel by pounding them from their shell and then soaking them in water to convert the cereal starches to sugars. Maybe, if she had been lucky in her gathering, she would have added some honey or fruits to sweeten it. Once she made her bowl of gruel, it would have been a short step to beer. All that was required was a moment of forgetfulness, a stray fleck of yeast, and the hot Mediterranean sun. By one definition, beer is simply rotten gruel. The recipe to change gruel into beer is simple. All that's required is time, heat, and a yeast like Saccharomyces paradoxus or cerevisiae, which converts the sugars into the grains into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Fortunately for Osiris, the required yeasts are everywhere. They are in honey, so if she chose some to use for her to sweeten her gruel, that would have kick-started the conversion. They are on acorns, so if Osiris had used the same pounding rocks for both her acorns and wheat, that could have begun the process. They're on insects, so if the right one landed on her gruel as it sat, that could also have started the fermentation. They even exist on the wild cereals themselves. Martin Zarnkow, professor of food and beer technology at the University of Munich, tells me. So, if she were willing to accept a bad yield, he says, Osiris wouldn't have needed to add anything at all. Whichever the case, if she forgot her gruel in the summer heat, it would have taken as little as a day to turn it into a deliciously fermented mistake. What would Osiris have tasted? Scott Ungerman, brewmaster at San Francisco's Anchor Brewing Company, tells me the rotted gruel, or light beer as it would be called today, would have had a sour, acidic taste from contamination by a bacteria called lactobacillus, which enters unsealed brews and produces a lactic acid byproduct. Modern breweries usually go to great lengths to avoid this kind of contamination, but in the case of a few sour brews, they introduce it intentionally, which means a few modern beers might even approximate the taste of the original. The closest beer to Osiris's drink still brewed today, according to Ungerman, is called a Berliner Weiss, which is a light, sour beer made without hops. Berliner Weisses are refreshing oddities, according to Beer and Brewing magazine, slightly hazy and effervescent with a light tang. However, the Berliner Weiss lacks the solid wheat that would have floated atop Osiris's brew, which is probably why Mesopotamian pictographs suggest they drank their beer through a straw. Osiris's beer would have had only half the alcohol concentration of even a light modern brew, so she wouldn't have become drunk, but she probably would have recognized and enjoyed its buzzy effect. So she would have made it again, and shared it, and even though gathering undomesticated wheat, barley, and rye was incredibly inefficient, beer, unlike bread, was worth it, if not for herself, then for the villagers next door. Previously, when they lived nomadically, the pre-Natufians simply move away from the troublesome neighbor. But for Osiris, who had permanent buildings and stockpiles of food to protect, this was no longer an option. As a consequence, archaeologists have found evidence that the Natufians frequently threw their version of the modern-day block party, which they held both to ease tensions and build social bonds. Under these circumstances, alcohol, the great social lubricant, would have become all the more essential. As Osiris and the other settlers of the Levant gathered wild cereals for their beer, paleobotanists speculate seeds would have occasionally fallen to the ground as they walked home. Over the generations, fields of wheat, barley, and rye sprouted near their villages. As these fields grew into a viable food source, the Natufians began to care for them. They weeded them, tilled their soil, and replanted the seeds. Eventually, what had begun as an inefficient food source grew into fields of productive, dense calories. At first, people probably cared for these fields of some of the time, then most of the time, and then full time. Because fields of crop can sustain far larger populations per square foot than hunting and gathering, the Natufian populations grew beyond what their old lifestyle could support. After a few generations of farming, the Natufians could no longer return to their previous ways without risking starvation. The pursuit of beer, and eventually bread, may have locked the Natufians and their descendants into an entirely different way of life. The theory that beer rather than bread, could have been the driving motivation behind the agricultural revolution is not known. It was first proposed in the 1950s by archaeologists like Robert Braidwood at the University of Chicago, but at the time the theory was largely dismissed. Paul Mangelsdorf, a Harvard botanist, summed up the general consensus in his response to Braidwood's 1953 article, "Did Man Once Live by Beer Alone?" when he wrote, "Are we to believe that the foundations of Western civilization were laid by an ill-fed people living in a perpetual state of partial intoxication?" But in 1972, the Nobel Prize-winning geneticist George Beadle solved the ancient mystery of corn's wild ancestor, and his discovery inadvertently tipped the balance of the beer versus bread debate. Beadle's discovery proved Homo sapiens were capable of domesticating a vital food source in the quest for booze by showing humans had done it again, this time on the other side of the world. Corn now provides the third most calories of any crop in the world, but unlike wheat, domesticated corn bears almost no resemblance to any fat plant found in the wild. Artificial selection has so radically changed corn that its wild ancestor remained unclear until Beadle's genetic test confirmed modern-day corn originated as the wild Mexican grass teosinte. This discovery forced anthropologists to reconsider why the Natufians first gathered cereals, because the wild wheat could have plausibly been gathered for bread. No one, no matter how hungry, would have ever bothered to gather teosinte. Teosinte is a useless food source. Like corn, it has ears, but you wouldn't know it without a microscope. An entire ear of teosinte contains fewer calories than a single kernel of modern corn. University of Michigan archaeologist Kent Flannery called teosinte starvation food, and the University of Wisconsin botanist Hugh Iltis called the protective case on wild teosinte so indestructible that human use of the grain is out of question. He goes on to wonder why anyone would bother to collect or try to grow this utterly useless grain when the grain itself is so permanently imprisoned. The answer is alcohol. The husk of teosinte is sweet, so it's thought that people living in what is now Mexico may have occasionally chewed the husk as candy. Eventually, some 7,000 years ago, they began to gather and press the cobs into a sweet juice. From there, teosinte juice needs only time to ferment into corncob wine. As corncob wine makers artificially selected for larger teosinte ears and scattered their seeds, the cobs naturally grew. But it took at least 3,000 years of artificial selection before teosinte ears were even 2 inches long, which is the first time it could plausibly have been used as food. Because domesticated wheat, barley, and rye are genetically similar to their wild ancestors, natural selection has worked far more quickly to turn them into productive foods. But the evidence and human nature suggest the process began the same way, with someone's discovery that a plant could produce alcohol. Who drank the first beer? The ancient Egyptians, who brewed it at least 17 varieties and branded them with names like the Heavenly and the Joybringer, had an answer. They believed beer was a gift from Osiris, their benevolent god of the afterlife. According to their belief, Osiris made a meal of water and sprouted grain and forgot it in the sun. The next day he discovered it had fermented, but decided to drink it anyway. He was so pleased with the sensation, the story goes, that he passed it on as a gift to humankind, which, around 10,000 years before the first Egyptian hieroglyph, is almost exactly how it occurred. Only Osiris wasn't the god of the afterlife. She was probably just a young woman living in the Middle East who left out her lunch. that is the end of that chapter. Please like and subscribe for more.